Hello, everyone. It is so good to see you here. Thanks so much for joining today. And today's workshop is called From Self Doubt to Impact, the 5 step leadership framework for product managers. And I just want to give a big thanks once again to the Product School for having me here again today. So today's session is actually part 2 of a 2-part series. I covered part 1 last week, which was a presentation of my 5-step leadership framework for product managers to help you go from self-doubt to impact. Now, for those of you who weren't here last week, I want to do a quick recap. So I'm Chealsea Wierbonski, and I'm a keynote speaker, a writer, and a career transformation coach. But I am also a group product manager at Google, where I've worked for nearly 14 years. And outside of my 9 to 5 at Google, I help ambitious professionals overcome self-doubt to make bold career moves, whether that means stepping into leadership, changing directions, or even starting something new. So I've been working in tech for nearly 30 years, and that means I have a lot of experience that I can draw upon to help people like you and the people that I work with to make powerful decisions that have a positive impact, not only on your careers, but also on your lives. And before I get started, I would just love to know who is in attendance today who saw last week's webinar or maybe watched the replay. So maybe you could just add a yes to the comments if you were in attendance or you watched the replay. Let's just do that quickly so I can get a sense. Okay, great. I'm also recognizing some names there. So it's so good to see you all again. Thanks so much, for last week and now for joining again this week. So as I was saying, last week I talked all about the concept of leading with inner strength, which is my personal framework for going from self-doubt to impact. And today I'm going to answer the questions that some of you added to the chat last week. And I'll also take any new questions that you might have, so you can just add them to the chat. I know I covered a lot of different concepts last week, so maybe some of you had some thoughts after you had a few days to process the information. We're also going to spend some time talking about how the framework can actually be applied to real-world product management scenarios, which I think is going to be really interesting. So just as a refresher, in last week's webinar, I talked all about how so many of us struggle with self-doubt. And to mitigate against this, we try to build our confidence through external validation, such as titles, recognition, approval from others, maybe how much money we're making. And you may have noticed that no matter how much external validation you get, if you have a feeling of self-doubt, it doesn't go away, regardless of how many of those external accomplishments you have. And that's because external validation just does not give us the confidence we need, and certainly not the kind of confidence we need to really show up as powerful product management leaders. True confidence and leadership ability doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within through something that I call leading with inner strength. And as I said last week, inner strength is that bridge that takes you from self-doubt to impact. And just again, as a refresher, leading with inner strength means placing a focus on inner work as opposed to outer tactics and skill building in order to build yourself up as a confident, healthy leader from the inside out. All right, so then we're going to take a quick look at the framework again. So I shared this 5-step framework that explains how you build your own inner strength so that you can lead with confidence, clarity, and conviction, and make the kind of bold career moves that are necessary for really high growth, high impact careers. So the first step, become aware of your limiting beliefs and negative narratives. And the recommendation here is to start noticing how you feel in different situations at work, as well as paying attention to the stories that you tell yourself, both in your mind and out loud when you're talking to other people. Number 2 is to shift your limiting beliefs and negative narratives. So once you've identified what those beliefs are, you can start observing yourself, engaging in self-doubt or negative talk. It's time to challenge it. And in order to challenge it, you'll want to find evidence that contradicts those beliefs and then reframe them. And a really important reminder here, because I know a lot of people have a really strong inner critic, is just to remember that your inner critic does not predict the future. It only repeats the past. Number 3 in the framework is to build your confidence from the inside out. So, again, not through external validation, but true confidence that isn't tied to titles, achievements, or approval from others. The kind of confidence that you build by taking on challenges that feel really, uncomfortably exciting, things that stretch you just beyond your comfort zone. Number 4, working from a place of alignment. Alignment happens when your career and actions match your true values and goals. And a lack of alignment can create inner conflict, which can lead to stress and then unproductive and even sometimes toxic behavior. And a really great way to understand if you're working in alignment, like I said last week, is to get clear on the vision you want for your career and your life, not just in terms of the external things you want to have, but in terms of how you feel. And then finally, number 5, leading with empathy, compassion, vulnerability, and authenticity. Because when you lead from a place of inner strength, you create a culture where people thrive. Teams just perform better when they feel safe, supported, and connected. And when you embody these leadership qualities, others just naturally see you as a leader, even if you don't have the title yet. All right. So, a few of you had questions last week. And like I said, if you have more questions, feel free to throw them in the chat there. But I did want to take some time talking through the questions and the answers. And then we'll go through some real world product management scenarios, reflections, and how you can apply this framework to those scenarios. So, the first question was to talk about perception and the first question, sorry, let me move this so I can see. Someone asked, how can we improve our inner thoughts when we feel like our leaders are not going in the right direction? How can we grow as product leaders to help our own leaders? So I thought this was really an interesting question because it basically draws attention to the fact that there's going to be times when we're in situations with maybe more senior leaders where they're saying things and we don't agree with them. And we have to sort of manage our own reaction and manage how we communicate our disagreement while also continuing to be supportive. Because the thing is like, let's say you're talking to a VP, you're likely not really going to be able to push back on that person just because of, seniority and just general respect for company hierarchy. I mean, unless you work in a startup or someplace like that, most hierarchies dictate these subtle rules that state like it's not appropriate to push back on super senior executive leaders. But you can still convey your opinion in a respectful way, in a way that offers, the way I like to think of it is like as a wise consult, like a person who is there to offer their perspective in sort of a neutral way, supported by facts, supported by data, and then give that perspective. And it's kind of up to the person who you're presenting that point of view to either accept your perspective or not. Now, in terms of how to improve your own inner thoughts, there comes a time when you kind of just have to accept, like, let's say this person just doesn't agree with you, where you have to just accept that you just don't see things differently. And in these situations, what I've found helpful is to actually really make an effort to understand that person's perspective. So a lot of the times when people are explaining how they feel or explaining how they view something, the person who's doing the explaining is saying one thing, but the person who's listening has their own subjective experience of what's being said. And a lot of the times, we're not fully understanding each other in an objective way because we all have our own subjective experiences. So if you keep that in mind, then you can say, well, let me really try to understand this person and try to understand their point of view, because obviously they think this is a great idea. So let me see if I can dig in more. And what I've found is if I'm having really strong thoughts of like opposition or disagreement, by taking an interest in understanding the other person, it takes the emphasis off of me feeling like, oh, I really don't agree with this. And I truly do then try to come to an understanding. And then that helps me to feel a little bit better about a decision if I don't agree with it. So, okay, number two. While self awareness is essential for personal growth, we also rely on feedback from stakeholders and teams. How can we make sure we're not getting too caught up in our own perceptions and stay open to valuable external insights? Okay, so one thing I want to call out here is that self awareness doesn't mean getting so caught up in your own thoughts and perspectives that you don't see anything else. Self awareness just means being aware of what you think, being aware of what you feel, being aware that other people have different perspectives. Just going back to what I just said about we all sort of live in our own subjective universe. So somebody could be saying something and you think they mean something, but in fact, it's not what they mean at all. And if you were to ask them and repeat back to them and reflect back to them what you're hearing, they might let you know, actually, that's not really what I meant. Or maybe they meant a more nuanced version of your interpretation. So I just want to stress the importance of this idea of self awareness and how being self aware does not mean getting caught up in your own perception. Self awareness just means being aware of how you think, how you feel, and how other people around you and how the environment that you're in impacts the way you think and feel. So if you think about self awareness in that way, there's going to be no way that you're not able to hear stakeholder feedback because part of self awareness means being open to what other people have to say and then being aware of your own interpretation of what they're saying and your own reaction and feeling and so on. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Feel free again to add things to the chat. I'm also going to just take a look over here. I see some people writing things. Okay, so Brian, I actually want to take a minute to talk about this. I see you put this in the chat a few minutes ago. One of your struggles is that you're not great at talking and thinking at the same time, meaning I take some time to digest what was said prior to responding. How can we shift the perception that this means I'm not confident? Okay, so that is such a good point. And it's a great question. And it's something that a lot of people experience. And in fact, I actually have a coaching client right now who is talking to the same thing about me. Because the truth is, like, some of us are processors. And some of us really like to be thoughtful and mindful and think about things before we talk. The way to sort of convey that to other people is just to be open about it and just to acknowledge what they're saying. You know, I hear you, I hear your perspective. I'd like to take some time to think about how I feel about that, or I'd like to take some time to form my own thoughts. So I think it's important just to acknowledge and then communicate with the person what you need and let them know you'll get back to them. You know, I'll get back to you tomorrow. I really want to think through this. I want to make sure I'm considering all aspects and I want to process it and understand how I feel. You just let people know what's going on with you. And hopefully you work in a safe enough environment where you can say stuff like that. All right, so number 3, product management often involves tough decision making under tight deadlines or shifting priorities. How can I stay true to my core values and principles when I'm under pressure? And what are some practical strategies to maintain alignment in the heat of the moment? Okay, this is such a big one for product managers because we are in these high stakes situations where we're talking to really senior executives at times, or engineers that we have to maybe get buy-in from or build buy-in from. Sometimes people can get intense, or they can get triggered. People have reactions. And then when you see other people responding to you in that way, that kind of makes you react. So I just want to acknowledge that I think that's one of the most challenging things about being a product manager is maintaining that sort of like neutral posture where you don't react. And the first thing I want to say is, first of all, we're human beings. So it doesn't matter like how much of a great product manager you are, you're always going to have feelings and you're going to respond. And that is totally okay. 100%. You're not superhuman. So try not to beat yourself up if that happens. Just remind yourself, like, this is just normal. Like, of course, I'm going to react. This person is saying something or behaving in a way that I don't like. It's triggering me. Totally fine. The key, though, is to try to create enough space between how you're feeling and then what your reaction is on the outside. And this is how you can really maintain your composure when you're under pressure. So if you're in a situation where priorities keep shifting and it's really frustrating because you started going down one path and then your senior management team decides, no, actually, we're going to do this other thing, that's frustrating. So you have to try to just honor how you feel, acknowledge that it's frustrating, but then try to manage it as best as you can by showing up in sort of like a professional, analytical, providing, consult when necessary, like being a wise advisor. For example, maybe you don't agree with the shift in priorities. You could say something like, I hear you about your desire to shift the focus, but I want to let you know by doing that, it's going to have this impact. And that way you kind of remove your emotions from it. And that's really what you want to do is you want to get to the point where you're allowing yourself to still feel those things, but you're not expressing them outward to other people. Acknowledge it, allow yourself to feel it, honor it, but try to get to the point where you have that space so that the way you feel on the inside is not just immediately reflected to everybody around you. And again, if you try to, like I said about question number one, if you try to approach these conversations more as a collaboration and taking an interest in what the other person's perspective is, then it kind of makes those feelings subside because you put the emphasis kind of on them and trying to understand them as opposed to thinking about like all of the things that you think are wrong with what they're saying. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have more questions about that, feel free to drop it in the chat. Okay, so this next, these are some good ones here. So number 4, sometimes being authentic and sincere, I can't control my reaction to things or conversations I don't like. How can I work on this? So I kind of answered this in these 3 questions that we went over. It's all about creating space between what you're feeling inside and versus how you're reacting on the outside. And that's not to say that you want to try to be dishonest with how you feel. It's just that there's, in order to maintain a level of professionalism, we can't always express our emotions as readily as we would like to at work. So the way to do that is just to honor your feelings and tell yourself, I feel this thing. It's okay that I feel this thing. I don't agree with them, but it's my job to figure out how to make this work. So I'm going to try to engage in a collaboration with this person where I'm trying to understand them. I'm trying to understand their perspective. And it becomes less about like you versus them and this contentious thing with tension and more about we're on the same team, we work for the same company. How can we actually help each other? And the goal here is to try to diffuse the feelings inside of you so that you can show up in a more productive way. Okay, so hopefully that helps. Number 5, can you talk about how to overcome imposter syndrome in the workplace? Okay, yes, I can. This is actually one of my favorite topics. I talk about it a lot. I actually have a course, a digital course that's dedicated to overcoming imposter syndrome. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. So I want to spend a moment to talk about it. So first of all, imposter syndrome comes from a feeling of unworthiness. It comes when we look outside of ourselves for validation or when we compare ourselves to other people. So those are sort of the 3 main sources of it. And when we're comparing ourselves to other people or looking outside of ourselves for validation, we're doing that to derive our own sense of self-worth. So we're looking outside of ourselves, we're looking externally, as opposed to looking inward. And we're not really able, when we do that, we're not really able to identify the value that we are bringing just by virtue of being our own unique selves with our own unique combination of experiences and talents and creativity and whatever other sort of contributing qualities that we have. So, the first thing when you're dealing with imposter syndrome is try to remind yourself that when you compare yourself to other people, that behavior is unproductive, meaning it doesn't serve you. So think about how you feel when you start looking around at other people and you're like, oh, they're doing so much better than me. So and so got this promotion faster than me. So and so got promoted to director. I didn't. Think about how that makes you feel. That feels really bad. It makes you feel bad about yourself and it diminishes all of the hard work that you've done. No doubt everyone here today has worked incredibly hard to get where they are. And so when you start looking at other people and telling yourself that you're somehow not doing as well as they are, you're really taking away from all that you've done and you're not honoring yourself and you're not honoring the work that you've done. So that's why it feels really bad. You're kind of beating yourself up in a way. It's also usually not based in reality or on facts because when we look at other people, we don't see the whole picture. We only see what they're posting on social media or on LinkedIn. And of course, people are only going to post the most amazing things about themselves. So you're not seeing the rest of their life, and you're also not seeing their own struggles that they've had to deal with. So it's not really a reality based comparison. A lot of the times, also, when we're engaging in that sort of comparison behavior, the narrative that we tell ourselves, like when we start saying, you're not doing as well as so and so, that comes from a critical inner narrative, or what we call a cognitive distortion. And that means you're viewing this situation from a lens of self criticism. And those perspectives are usually never true, even when they feel true. So you have to remind yourself of that you're not seeing things accurately in those moments. And what you're saying is not based on fact. Comparison also takes a lot of mental bandwidth. And then it usually generates anxiety because then you start stressing out about the fact that you're not performing as well as you want to. And then that also takes a lot of mental bandwidth. And so all of that rumination is really mentally and emotionally draining. And it makes dealing with work really challenging. And so that's another important thing to remember. At its core, feelings of imposter syndrome are tied to limiting beliefs about yourself and your abilities. So, in other words, you believe that you aren't capable of doing something. So and so got it and I didn't. Therefore, they have it and I can't have it. Not true. Also, if you think about if other people saw you and everything that you did, like on paper, they would view you in the way that you're viewing other people. So that's what you have to remember is that you look like a success story when other people look at you. So just as I mentioned in the Leading with Inner Strength framework, you're going to want to try to identify exactly what is the negative narrative that you're telling yourself when you're feeling that imposter syndrome feeling. And then work on reframing that narrative with a positive and expansive narrative. So, for example, let's say you get asked to lead a new project and you just feel way out of your depth and you start feeling like an imposter and you're telling yourself, I don't know what I'm doing. What if they all find out? How did I get here? All the things we say. Just pause, stop yourself right there. And instead of engaging in that thought pattern of criticism and negative narratives and critical thinking and sort of like viewing the world through limitation, remind yourself of all of the work that you did up to this point that sets you up for the ability to take on the new project. All right, so that's a lot about imposter syndrome, but I know it's a big topic for everyone. So I wanted to spend some time talking about it. If you have sort of any more questions about it, drop it in the chat and we can talk about it. Let me just take a look here, what people are saying. It's a lot of activity. I love it. Okay. It seems like just discussion at this point. So, okay. That's great. I'm glad you guys are chatting with each other. All right, so number 6, how do you choose something that strengthens you versus overwhelms you? So this was a question in response to the section of the talk where we talked about building your authentic confidence. And one of the things I suggested was to grow your authentic confidence to really try to put yourself in situations that stretch but don't overwhelm you. So the way to figure out what is the right stretch opportunity is, again, to pay attention to how you feel. So I'm going to use public speaking as an example because it's something that, I know really well because I'm a public speaker, and also people talk about it all the time because most people are terrified of public speaking. So right now, in my current state of existence, I'm a keynote speaker. I get up on stage, I talk to hundreds of people, both live and virtually, and I don't even think about it. But there was a time not too long ago. Well, I mean, maybe it was long, but it doesn't feel like that long ago. Maybe 15 years ago or so, where I was so terrified to talk to a group of people that I didn't even want to introduce myself at like a team event. Okay. I would get so nervous when we would all be sitting at a table, and you would have to go and do a round robin and say something about yourself. I would feel myself shaking in anticipation, waiting for my turn. Like, oh my God, what am I going to say? Like, this is horrible. I just want to get this over with. I wish I could leave the room. And I would do everything I could in my power to avoid talking. Okay. Now, for me to go from there to what I do now, like get up on a stage and talk to like 400 people, that is a massive stretch. That would have been overwhelming. So if I would have tried to say, I'm going to overcome my fear of public speaking, I'm going to sign up to talk at Grace Hopper and present to 400 people, that would have been too much. It would have felt overwhelming. So instead, what I did was I started small. You take incremental steps. So you look for opportunities that feel challenging. They feel a little bit scary, but you feel like I could probably manage that. That's how you choose something that strengthens you versus overwhelms you. Then when you do that thing, you kind of do it for a little while, you get comfortable with it, and then it starts to feel like no big deal. Then you look for something else. So the idea here is you're taking incremental steps to work your way up to that bigger challenge that you ultimately want to do. Let's move on now. Okay, so any questions about anything that I talked about there before we move on to the PM scenarios? Just type them in the chat if you do. Okay. So what I did here was I tried to think of many of the different things that we go through as PMs and to think about how you can apply the framework to that. So in scenario number 1, your decision is challenged in a leadership meeting. And this came up a little bit in the questions already. But the scenario here is, let's say you're leading a major product initiative and you've done all this research and you did all your back channel one-to-one meetings to align all the stakeholders. You did your customer validation. Then you do your big exec review. You present your recommendation, and a senior executive immediately pushes back, questioning your decision and suggesting an alternative approach that won't work. Now, I'd like for you guys to take a minute and think about, in this situation, okay, your decision being challenged by a senior leader, how do you think your self-doubt would show up in that moment? Now, you can, if you feel open and you feel like you want to sort of volunteer information, write it in the chat because I'd love to see it. Or you can just jot this down yourself, like on a piece of paper, in a notebook, on your phone, whatever. You're also going to have this deck, so you can come back to these prompts on your own. So think about, what does that do to your self-doubt when you're in those meetings? And then the second thing I want you to think about is, given that your self-doubt is cropping up and probably you have these feelings of imposter syndrome in those moments, you're like, you worry that these people are viewing you in an unfavorable way. What would it look like to respond from a place of authentic confidence rather than defensiveness or hesitation? So, really think about that. And then, number three, how could you balance your confidence with flexibility? In other words, how could you hold your ground without seeming closed off? And I talked about this a little bit earlier when I was going through the questions. So think about that. If you'd like to write some of your answers here in the chat, I'd love to see them. If not, totally understand. It's a little difficult to be vulnerable sometimes, but it's also helpful for other people to know that they're not alone. I promise you that everyone pretty much feels the same way in these situations. Okay, so I'm going to tell you how you can apply the framework to these scenarios. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you're in this situation, because you're being challenged and you're starting to feel all of the familiar thoughts of self-doubt. Maybe I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe I don't deserve to be here. People think I'm incompetent, whatever it is. We all have our own narratives. You're going to want to be mindful that you're doing that. And even if you can't do this in the situation, because sometimes in these moments, we don't have a lot of time to process, just going back to, I think it was Brian's comment earlier about how sometimes you need time to process, totally fine. You can process it after. But what you're going to want to do is reframe that narrative. So instead of thinking they don't trust my judgment, shift it to, this is just a leadership conversation. And I actually belong here. We are having a discussion, and try to make it less about you and less about the leader or the executive in question, less about them like persecuting you or singling you out. It's usually not personal. It's like see things a different way, whatever it is. Just try to remember that it's just a discussion and it doesn't have anything to do with you, your self-worth, your ability. They have questions, and that's really the end of it. Then the second thing you're going to want to do, just again, applying the framework, notice what you're feeling and then regulate those feelings, especially if you have to respond to the person. So this is something that you do have to kind of learn how to do in the moment. And that's why it's really important to learn how to create the space between what you're feeling on the inside and what you express in your voice on the outside. So you're going to want to notice like, okay, I'm feeling triggered, or I'm feeling a lot of self-doubt right now. I actually feel really bad about myself. You can take a few deep breaths to kind of try to calm yourself down, slow your nervous system down. You can tell yourself before you talk, I feel myself getting triggered, but I'm going to choose to stay calm in this moment. And then when you respond, acknowledge what they say and then just kind of redirect it. So instead of getting defensive or defending your position, because let me tell you, when you're in this kind of situation, the worst thing you can try to do is lean in and dig in to defending your position. Because a lot of the times, especially with exec reviews or really senior people, they want to feel heard. They want to add value. Like their job is to lead also, like to lead the company on a macro level. And they need to feel like they're contributing and they need to feel like they're leading. And if you shut them down by getting defensive, they don't feel heard. And then they're going to push back even more. So what you want to try to do is to help them and feel like you heard them and you're considering what they have to say. So instead of getting defensive, you can say something like, I see why that perspective is important. You could either say, if you need time to process, you can say, let me make a note of that and I'll give it some thought. And then can I set up a follow-up with you to come back and we can talk about it further? Or you can say, if you feel pretty strong in your idea, you could say something like, let me walk you through why we landed on this approach. And here's the data to support it. So the key takeaway here is that you want to use the inner strength framework so that you can stay composed and assertive, but not reactive when you're being challenged in leadership conversations. All right. Any questions about that? I want to just take a look over here. Okay, Nat, thank you so much for your answers. Yep, I didn't prepare enough. Respond with, I did as best as I could. Yes, 100%. Like that is so important, especially because we all go to work really trying to do the best job. Like that's the thing to remember is you gave it your best. and if it didn't land in the way that you thought it would or that you wanted it to, that's just a learning experience. It's not a failure. So I think that's great. You did as best as you could in a limited time. And yes, leadership feedback is a new perspective. This is great. Really, really good. Okay. Yes, Michelle. Yeah, it is. So Michelle says it's interesting to change the perspective that leadership needs to feel validated as well. Such a good insight, and something to keep in mind, that just because executives are executives doesn't mean they're not human. They go to sleep, they wake up, they brush their teeth, they have fights with their family, they have to like deal with their kids, like whatever. They are human beings. They're going through exactly what you're doing outside of work. Nothing makes them different. So they have the same imposter syndrome. Even though they might seem confident, I guarantee you that they feel or have felt imposter syndrome. They have self-doubt. They get triggered. They want to feel validated. They want to feel important. They want to feel like they're contributing. They have these same experiences. So it's easy to forget that, though, when we see people kind of like hierarchically above them. We kind of place unreasonable expectations on them sometimes. So it's important to remember that, because then it kind of levels the playing field a little bit. It can make them feel not so intimidating, because you're like, this person's just a person. They're doing the best they can. Maybe they didn't communicate that feedback in a way that was very kind or sensitive or whatever. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and try to help them feel heard or seen or validated or whatever it is. Okay, so let's move on to the next scenario. Scenario number 2, handling a difficult stakeholder who undermines you. Possibly one of my least favorite scenarios at work, but I think it's an important one, my favorite one in terms of helping people how to deal with it. So you're working with a highly influential engineering lead who subtly undermines your authority, disregarding your input in meetings, prioritizing work differently than agreed upon, and challenging your decisions in front of other people. Okay, so I have a friend who's a product manager, and she and I don't know if she might be on here. We were walking to dinner last week, and she was describing this exact scenario. This can be really disheartening when we experience this as product managers. So I want to acknowledge that this is never fun. It can feel pretty bad when it happens. So again, discussion prompts for you guys. If you want to add them in the chat, go ahead. If you want to just take this for your own reflection, you can do that. But what kinds of limiting beliefs do you think would surface in these situations? Next, you want to think about, how do you establish your credibility and influence without becoming overly aggressive? Because the truth is the product manager, in most situations, you're the one that's responsible for driving things. So if you have somebody undermining you, you do have to find a way to sort of reset the balance where you're the one driving things and you're building alignment with that particular lead. And then the third question for you is, how can you use empathy and compassion to navigate that stakeholder relationship? Because, the usual response is because we feel like that person is quote unquote doing something to us. They're like challenging us or disrespecting us. Our inclination is to do something sort of equally defensive back. So how can we show up in a more compassionate way towards that person? So that's something to think about. And again, if you'd like to drop some answers or reflections in here, I'd love to see them. But I'm going to talk you through how you could apply the framework here. So first, just like all of this stuff, and just like step 1 and 2 in the framework, reframe that self-doubt. So again, be aware of the limiting beliefs thinking and the negative narrative. So instead of thinking, maybe I'm not being effective as a PM, or, maybe I'm not smart enough, or maybe they don't view me as a leader. Like, what you're doing when you do that is you're putting the blame on you. So this person is behaving in a way that's not really appropriate, but you're putting the blame on yourself. A lot of people do that. So it's important to sort of remember that you're not doing anything wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. This person is just not handling things very well. So then you want to shift that narrative to a more empowering narrative. So instead of saying, maybe I'm not being effective as a product manager, shift to, I'm leading this product and I have valuable insight to contribute. And that helps you to feel just more empowered. And again, makes it like less about a criticism of you and the job that you're doing or your leadership abilities. So the next thing you're going to want to do is to set boundaries with compassion, because again, in most companies, the product managers are supposed to be driving the strategy, the prioritization, supposed to be aligning with your engineering counterparts and stakeholders, but ultimately the product managers are usually the ones leading the effort. So it's important to set that boundary with whomever you're working with. So this is a time for a one-to-one, a really calm but direct one-to-one conversation. So this is not the kind of thing that you want to ignore because you're afraid of confrontation, which is something that a lot of people do. And I am guilty of that as well. I did that a lot. I didn't want to deal with it, or I thought that maybe the engineer knew better than me, but it's important to set a boundary. And you can say something like, I've noticed some misalignment in how we're prioritizing work. I want to ensure that we're collaborating effectively. What's your perspective? So again, you're making it collaborative. You're not going to them and being like, I really didn't like what you did. You disrespected me. How could you do this? That's really confrontational. And if you do that, that person's going to behave in response with confrontation. So you definitely don't want to do that. You want to just observe what happened. I noticed we're not aligned. How can we work together? Tell me what you need so we can work together. And that feels much more collaborative, and you're friendly. And then the person's gonna, unless they're really operating on some different type of guidance system, in most cases, you're going to diffuse their defensiveness or whatever proving energy they have that they're bringing to the table. And the important thing in that conversation is, instead of blaming, focus on alignment. So don't talk about what they did or how it was wrong or how, they violated your authority, but talk about the impact of their behavior. So when you do X, Y happens. For example, when you give your team priorities after I've given the team priorities, it creates confusion and people don't know what to work on. Therefore, it's important for us to align so that we go to the team with a single unified voice and approach. So again, it's much more collaborative. It's about how can we work together? Even though I know on the inside, a lot of us would love to be like, you really messed up. How could you do that to me? Don't ever do that. Make it more about how can we work together, and just make them aware of the impact of their behavior, because a lot of the times people don't realize it. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't understand just how confusing that can be to a team to behave in that way. Okay, so then finally, number 4, when you're doing this, it's important to have confident presence in these conversations. So, if you're feeling bad about yourself and you're feeling like maybe it's your fault or you're blaming yourself, it's going to be hard to do this. So that's why number 1 is really important. Reframe that self-doubt. Because when you're talking to them, you want to look them in the eyes. You want to stay calm. You want to speak with clarity. You want to speak with confidence. And you're demonstrating that inner strength, the inner confidence, not forced authority, not you have to do this because that's what it is, that's how it's set up. It's more of a, let me lead you. Let me show you how to do this in a way that's collaborative and effective so that our team is productive and executes well. So the key takeaway here is that leadership, especially with product management, is about influence. Usually we don't manage the teams that we're supposed to be leading. So you really do have to lead through influence. So it's important to learn this skill, to learn this dynamic of how to align even the most resistant stakeholders. Okay, so let's see. Nat has a question here. Do you have tips on how to reframe your self-doubt and apply this framework in live conversations with limited time, such as a job interview? Okay, so that's a good question. Now, the key to all of this stuff is to not just implement it like on the fly in a job interview. This is kind of like, think of this as a practice that you want to implement on a day-to-day basis. It's sort of like it's like exercising or meditation or something like that. It's a skill. So the more you do it, the easier it's going to get and the more natural it's going to get. So if you wait until you're in a job interview, it's going to be hard to call this stuff up. But if you get in the habit of learning how to reframe your negative narratives, reframe your self doubt in every situation, then when you're in these critical moments, like a job interview, it'll be easier to do. But I recognize, this is a process. So maybe you're in that situation and it starts happening. The most important thing to do is to regulate your breathing. Try to calm yourself down. Try to detach from your thoughts. Try to remind yourself, I deserve to be here. So you want to just be aware of what you're thinking and then remind yourself, I deserve to be here. I can do this. This is a learning experience. You have to identify the things that are going to calm you. And that's going to be different for everyone. So hopefully that helps. But the idea would be to sort of develop this habit before you're in those situations so that when you're in them, it's just a little easier to implement. Okay, scenario number 3. You're asked to lead a high stakes initiative and you just don't feel ready. This is like classic imposter syndrome. So, maybe leadership unexpectedly asks you to take over this really high visibility, super complicated initiative, and immediately your self doubt creeps in. I'm not ready, or I don't have enough experience, or what if I fail? What if I can't do this? And then what if people think that I can't do my job? What if I'm incompetent? You can feel that imposter syndrome creeping in, and you consider recusing yourself from the project. Don't ever do that, by the way, because you can always do it. You can always muster up the energy and the sort of conviction and the empowerment. All right, so discussion prompts for you. Again, you can drop some answers in the chat or just think about these on your own. So how do you recognize and reframe your self-doubt and negative narratives in that moment? And you notice through all of these scenarios, the first step is always recognizing those limiting beliefs, negative narratives tied to self-doubt, and so on. So always try to look for those. Then how can you shift your mindset? So what can you tell yourself to go from that feeling of, or that belief or narrative, I'm not ready, to, I can figure this out. No one said that when you do something new that you have to have it all figured out. Nobody does. The difference between highly successful people and people that maybe just kind of stay in their careers and don't do a lot of radical advancement is the willingness to figure things out as they go, to take a risk, to feel a little afraid, to feel uncomfortably excited, to put themselves in those stretch scenarios. And I think this is a common misconception, that we think we need to feel ready before we do something. We think we need to have all the accolades, the credentials, whatever it is, but that's not true. You can 100% figure stuff out as you go along. We're all in tech. We're all good at figuring things out. That's like the sort of core of being an engineer, right? It's you figure it out. You can do the same thing with projects. So that's what you want to do. Remind yourself that I am capable of figuring things out. I'm capable of learning. I'm capable of growing, and I'll make it happen. I'll figure it out as I go along. Then the next reflection, how can you apply the uncomfortably exciting principle to this? So again, embrace the opportunity. You don't quite feel ready, but remind yourself by putting yourself in these situations that you're going to grow. All right, so I see we got another comment there. Yes, exactly. That's a great one. Okay, so we kind of talked through how to apply the framework already on this. But one thing I want to highlight here, because I didn't really talk about it yet, is this idea of an abundance mindset. And for those of you that aren't familiar with an abundance mindset is a mindset that looks at the world and their careers through the lens of opportunity, growth, expansion, sort of like all of those really proactive, positive qualities. An abundance mindset is, in fact, the opposite of something that's called a scarcity mindset. And a scarcity mindset is a pattern of thinking that views the world and work through the lens of limitation, meaning I can't do this thing, or this is going to be so hard, or that person is successful, therefore I can't be successful, or I'm not going to share any information with anyone because that'll give them an advantage over me. That's fear based thinking. And it keeps you constricted and it keeps you tight. And it doesn't allow you to grow and expand like an abundance mindset does. An abundance mindset is the thing that allows you to embrace these opportunities when they come up because you're excited by the opportunity to grow and you see the potential. So that's the difference there. And it's really important when you're in these situations to have that abundance mindset. And sort of like a good thing to say in those cases is, instead of saying, I don't have enough experience, say, I have the ability to figure things out as I go. So we talked about that a lot on the previous slide, but that's the idea there. All right, so I'm going to move on in the interest of time because I think we talked through most of this stuff. Scenario number 4, balancing strategy versus execution under pressure. So this is another one that came up. Your leadership team wants to accelerate the roadmap all the time, right? Asking your team to deliver twice as fast with no additional resources. Welcome to 2025 and 2024. That's the world we're all living in. But you know that rushing the execution will lead to poor outcomes, but your leadership team doesn't want to hear it. They're not open to the pushback. So all sorts of things can start coming up in this situation. And you got to navigate that inner conflict between being a team advocate and not wanting to stress your team out, and then aligning with the business goals. And this is a tough one, especially right now. So that's a reflection for you. How do you think you can navigate that inner conflict? And then number 2, how can you communicate with clarity and confidence to your leadership team without sounding negative? That's another tough one. All right, so we're going to apply the framework again. Again, hopefully you can see the pattern here. Number 1, notice how you're feeling. What are you saying? What are the limiting beliefs? What's the negative narrative? What's the self-doubt coming up? You're feeling frustrated. You're feeling triggered. But it's really important in this situation to regulate your nervous system, taking that deep breath, reminding yourself, I feel triggered, but that's okay. I'm choosing to respond without frustration. Because a calm presence is what really gives credibility to your leadership abilities. Number 2 is you're going to want to use that authentic confidence to praise your guidance. And I've talked about this. This is like another common theme, being like the wise advocate. So instead of automatically saying, we're going to need more time, you're out of your mind, there's no way we can do this, you can gently push back and say, you know what, to make sure what we launch is of high quality, we really need to prioritize the delivery in phases. Here's the trade-offs we're considering. And through a conversation like this, you can try to negotiate with your stakeholders and say, okay, maybe we can't deliver exactly what you said, but here's the way we can get to an MVP or something that's pretty close by making a few trade-offs. Will this do? You know, because most people are reasonable. And if you go to them with solutions instead of just saying, that's a terrible idea, this will never work, you're going to stress out the team, blah, 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 like all this stuff, those are all problems. The leadership people are usually getting pressure from above, and they're trying to satisfy their own goals and their own sort of OKRs or whatever they are. So when you try to work with them to make them successful, then they're going to respect that a lot. So go back with like a negotiation with a proposal. You know, it's just like when you buy something and you're negotiating, they come to you with an ask and you're like, you know, that won't quite work, but how about this? Here's a way that I think we can come close to accomplishing that goal while, you know, not fully getting like making the team work, you know, 7 days a week for 10 hours a day or whatever it is. All right, so we're almost out of time, but I just want to say all of these scenarios are in the slides. You guys are going to get the slides. You can read through. Let's see what this is. There's one more scenario after this. So you can read through it on your own. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I will happily engage in the questions there. And I want to just look at the comments again before we go. Okay, great. You are so welcome, you all. It's so exciting to talk to so many different product managers and to see so many of you on this workshop. I have to say, when I first became a product manager, hardly anyone knew what that was. So it's just great to see that the field has grown so much and there's so many of you, and it's such a well established role and so important in a high functioning, well established technology company. All right. Thank you again, everyone. Oh, let me just remind you, if you want to follow me, I would love for you to do that. Here's my handles. Instagram is the one I post a ton of videos. So make sure to follow me there. And I talk about a lot of stuff. And then, of course, sign up for my newsletter. You can scan the QR code there. Um, yeah. But thank you so much, everyone. And thanks for all of your engagement and your comments. And like I said, when you get the deck, if you have any questions about the scenarios or how to apply the framework, you can just reach out to me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.